Kevin Loux is a young professional with a background in technology, economics, and law. In June of 2015, as the Director of Strategic Partnerships, he became the third staff member of Shaping Our Appalachia Region, a nonprofit economic development organization established by Governor Steve Beshear and Congressman Hal Rogers. You might know it better as SOAR. In his work experience, innovative use of technology often played a key role in problem solving, enabling efficiency and productivity. And as a young economic developer, he has helped his organization find a niche focusing on technology and broadband-centric strategies, leveraging Kentucky Wired. In addition to his experience, he completed a 4-year college degree in 2 calendar years. I bet your parents were so proud. He received a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration with a focus on business economics from the University of Central Florida. He also received his Juris Doctor from the University of Kentucky while attending as a recipient of the Provo Fellowship. Leveraging his law and economics background enables him to bring value and a pragmatic solution-oriented perspective. Aside from his formal education, technology has been an interest of his since a very young age. His passion provides him with over 2 decades of experience and expertise using various operating systems, as well as a wealth of experience and certifications for many applications and coding languages. My friend and yours, and a tremendous asset for Southern and Eastern Kentucky, Kevin Loux.
Thank you. I'll try to keep this pretty simple as you're all eating lunch. A lot of what we're going to talk about here today is stuff we've already mentioned, but I'm going to try to put it in a little bit different context, make it a little bit easier to understand. So, for the past century, improvements in physical transportation infrastructure, such as highways, have enabled communities to connect with the world and flourish. But for the next century, we know our communities will need improvements in digital transportation infrastructure to drive improvements in everything from healthcare to education to overall quality of life. If we know we need improvements in this type of infrastructure, the question becomes, how do we bring affordable, high-speed broadband into our community? Communities faced with this question can be overwhelmed by options and decisions while being pulled in different directions through consultants, engineers, and providers. This can result in information overload for communities, and the focus on the technical complexities ultimately doesn't help us to address our fundamental question, which is, what should my community do and why? What does technology mean for my community, and how will it help us grow? Here, we're looking at a seemingly technical problem, how to improve community broadband. But if we want to solve a problem, one of the best ways to do this is to employ root cause analysis using the 5 Why system uncovered in the Toyota production system. If you're not familiar with the Toyota production system, let me walk you through the classic example. Here, take the problem, my car will not start. First question, why? The battery is dead. Why? The alternator is not working. Why? The serpentine belt was worn beyond its useful life and not replaced. Why? The vehicle was not serviced regularly. Why? Because the consumer couldn't afford for regular maintenance and service, so they didn't have service on the vehicle. So here we see the problem. My car will not start. Instead of just taking the Band-Aid approach solution and installing a new battery, by using the 5 Why system, we uncovered the root cause here, and that it was a failure to plan for service and budget accordingly. This lets us see not just the symptom of the problem, but the actual root cause. And as we saw through this process, we had a bunch of technical complexities, but ultimately when you break it down through the system, you get to a human cause and a relatable problem that's easy to fix. So let's learn from our poor car owner example. We know the reason they had that problem was because they failed to plan. So let's apply this to broadband and plan for our community's future. Let's walk through the problem again. The problem, my community doesn't have enough broadband. Why? Because our existing service is either slow or not available to all residents. Why? Because our existing ISP has not built it. Why? Because people won't buy it if they do. Why? Because it would be too expensive to consumers. Why? Because it's a rural area that's not densely populated, and charging more is the only way for these private providers to make money. So once again, we see now the root cause. Our problem isn't just how do we get more broadband into our community, it's how can we get more affordable, high-speed broadband into our communities. This is where our community can play a role in providing a solution to this problem by working with existing providers and helping them to realize greater economies of scale. We all know partnerships are a critical role here, and as many partnerships as we can pull together as a community working with these providers is a critical piece to the puzzle. So, as we learned from our car owner example, we know we need to start by planning, though. We need to plan for the future and begin with the end in mind. That means we need to have a vision of what we want our community to look like. How do we want to be using this technology? We all know a vision without funding is a hallucination. But with that being said, you still need the vision. You still need to have the plan. You're not going to walk into a bank without a business plan and expect to get funding for your project. This is the same thing here. Knowing what you want to do ahead of time, having that plan is a critical component to securing funding. Just like with the business plan, demand is a critical component to the success of a project for affordable high-speed broadband. While we don't have time to get into meaningful use and building community consensus right now, Nancy will be talking about building community champions, building teams more later on today. And our last mile action team is also here as a resource to help connect you with these partners and consultants that can help you through this process. Ultimately, it's going to be up to you thinking about, as a local community, what's your vision? You might ask, why do we need to spend time thinking about driving demand for broadband? Why do we need to spend time thinking about this? Think about the other services you set up the last time you moved. Water, sewer, and electric. Did they ask you what voltage or flush capacity you needed? Utility providers don't ask consumers to think in engineering terms. The focus is on the application of these technologies and not the technical details. And that's the key to driving demand. Successful last mile efforts need to set out with a clear end in mind and work backwards. That vision of an affordable, high-speed broadband network is one commonly shared vision for our communities. But having those specific uses in mind for how this technology will benefit your community is going to be critical when you get into the implementation details, those details where you do need that technical expertise. One example would be if you're looking to get broadband for your industrial park. Well, a critical implementation decision would make sure that you have redundant fiber routes there. Otherwise, you're not going to get prospective clients interested in this. Same thing if you're looking for remote work opportunities. If your last mile is over a copper infrastructure or wireless infrastructure, that might not be adequate for that vision. So knowing what you want to do before you get started is going to prevent you from taking this Band-Aid type solution that's going to result in cutting corners to save costs that undermines your original vision. So let's break down the three key elements of access to affordable, high-speed broadband. I'm going to walk you through the aspects of deciding to become a community involved in deploying affordable, high-speed broadband, what that entails, and define exactly what we mean when we say that. The ultimate decisions will be up to your community. No one can tell you what is the best fit for you, or this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. But what I want to have you go through today is understanding not just some of these recommendations, but why they're being made. Understanding the root cause that's driving these recommendations, and then to use your own creative problem solving and knowledge of your community to maybe think of either better or additional solutions for your community. So as we talked about earlier, financing is critical here. And while this is not an exercise focusing on securing financing, it is an exercise that will help you draft that project narrative section for a grant application or that business plan for securing additional capital. So this is still a critical piece that has to come before securing financing. And since cost is the critical consideration for many of us, let's start by determining what makes a project affordable. In order to compete in the global digital economy, the cost to the consumer in the rural market must be competitive with the cost to a consumer in an urban market. If we're competing on a level playing field, we need to have the same factors of production, the same costs going into our exporting of assets. There are two common ways of looking at affordability. One's by looking at total project cost to build the network, and the others simply look at the cost to the consumer. Ultimately, as we discussed in our root cause analysis, the reason the consumer is paying a high price is because that's what makes the business model work for the provider. This is why we'll primarily focus on that business model and how we can drive down that cost to provide the providers even greater economies of scale. It's important to know, we've talked about this earlier, Kentucky Wired and East Kentucky Networks are middle mile providers that have a role here to play in driving down cost and providing access. But our primary focus is on last mile factors of production, or the cost of deploying last mile. There are three key elements here: the cost of construction, the terms of the financing, and your market density in a rural market. So let's start with the cost of construction. As you can see from the slide up on the screen, you'll see urban versus rural. As I talked about, we need to be competitive with an urban market, but look at our market analysis. You're looking at $68 per user per month just to build the network. That's not any of the operations, that's not any of the overhead, versus about $30 in an urban market. And if you look at the terms up on the sheet, we see the terms of financing for the private sector are the same, the length is about the same, a reasonable return for them. The biggest difference is that first number right there. It's the market density. We talked about this earlier, I'm not going to get into too much detail. But the next thing I want to talk about is, if we have that problem with the market density, what can we do with the terms of financing? So here's one idea. As you can see from the slide on the screen, on the one side, you see $68.72. That's that project build cost. When you factor everything else into providing the internet service to a consumer, you get up to about $134 a month. That's simply not competitive with our urban markets. But on the other side of this graph, you'll see what happens when the community decides to become invested in this project and a partner. The cost to the consumer goes down by more than half. That project build cost goes from 68 all the way down to 24. And it's because of the terms of financing. It's because as a community you have access to grant funding. It's because you have access to longer term bonds. It's all of these resources that you can help the private providers with to make this project more affordable. So the next thing I want to get into is making sure our last mile project is congruent with our vision. And that means it needs to be high speed. But what do we mean by high speed? So I think the important thing to note here is if broadband can provide future opportunities to our community in the way that highways provided opportunities, the one thing they both have in common is the need for high speed. Imagine building a one-way highway infrastructure into your community, but you only had dirt roads to leave. UPS might deliver goods to your community, but you wouldn't be able to export your community assets very efficiently. UPS, in the same way, UPS would also not be able to hire remote workers in a community with analogous digital infrastructure. So that's where I want to point out the slide on the screen now. This is the disconnect between the digital economy and our communities. The people that want to work without this infrastructure can't get access to these types of jobs. We have an example of a real-world person who was in one of these communities. As you can see, you're looking at, on average, about 5 megabits per second upload speed required for some of these jobs. Some of our communities don't have those speeds today, but that's what we need to compete in the digital economy. So you can see this person had a job with Amazon. She was excited to get to work, but see, her provider simply couldn't offer her the speed she needed because they couldn't make the business model work. So what do we need to do now? What is the answer? Well, we need to more closely define high speed. So the way we'd like to define high speed is fiber-fed, symmetrical infrastructure that results in a future-proof build that can be adapted to meet any new FCC definition of broadband. Today, it's 25/3. Our last mile team has chosen to define broadband as 10 by 10 to highlight the importance of upload speed in remote work infrastructure, in remote work employment. But that definition's changing, but the one thing that's constant is fiber-fed is critical. As we talked about with some of the phased approaches and some of those wireless deployment methods, they still need to be fiber fed. That's a critical piece. So using phased last mile to reduce your initial deployment cost is one key strategy, but having that fiber trunk is critical for remote work opportunities and the connection to the digital economy. We know fiber to the premise is not viable in all communities today. That's why we're strongly suggesting you look at this phased last mile development, because it's one way you can slow down your project cost without undermining your ultimate vision. Ultimately, I think one thing we'd all agree on is the most critical part to all of this when we're talking about access to affordable, high-speed broadband is the first part, access. Without access, this doesn't mean anything to us. If it's one community over, it doesn't mean anything to our community. But let's break that down a little bit. Providers might already be working on expanding service areas, but if we're saying our community has an access problem, what we're really saying is that the deployment effort is not happening fast enough, and we want to help speed up this process. As we saw from our root cause analysis, the reason we have this problem is because it's simply not profitable for existing ISPs. This is why we're suggesting one possible solution to this problem would be community involvement in the process. Ultimately, everything discussed here today means nothing, though, if we're not left with a simple plan of action for what your community can do to implement this locally. If our community wants broadband fast, we need to become involved and a part of the process in helping existing ISPs realize greater economies of scale. Included in my handouts over on the side table is a Fiber Authority Action Steps template, or FAST, so that your community can build the team to work on these efforts and get the process moving faster. At the end of the day, Hilda and Larry will talk more about what that means. They'll talk more about these fiber boards. But in the handouts over there, there's a template to show you exactly how to set this up. It's got the ordinance, everything ready to go for you. Don't forget, our last mile team is here as a resource to help you along this process. In the handouts as well, you'll see our last mile database highlighting everything our team knows about what your communities are doing. And so you might see your county with a 0 or a 1 next to it. That doesn't mean you're not doing anything. That means we don't know about it. Let us know. We can't help you if we don't know what you're doing. So we'd be happy to update that table, have all the new information in there, but you have to get in contact with us. You have to let us know how we can help you. Even if you ultimately decide either you have a fiber authority already or it's not a fit for your community, hopefully now you can see a little bit more of the root cause analysis for making the business model work for providers and why you might be in the situation. There are many different models for broadband deployment, but if you share the vision of growing your community through broadband, deploying an affordable high-speed broadband network is critical, and the Fiber Authority Action Steps template is a great place for you to get started. So in conclusion, let's remember, our car owner was dealing with a broken car, not because some unfortunate misluck with a dead battery. It was because they failed to plan. Hopefully, this will help you in your ongoing discussions in your community with your local team as you decide what's the best fit for your community to plan going forward. Remember, if you want access to affordable high-speed broadband, providers could use help from you, and we are here to help you, so you're not alone in this process. So we've gone over some of the first steps today. You obviously need to get into more details with the feasibility study, getting your routes mapped out, getting some of these more detail, getting a budget, getting all that put together. So that's something our last mile team will be here as a resource to help your communities with going forward. So please just stay in contact with us. Slides and everything are over on the side table. Let us know how we can help. Thank you.
You're not done yet. Do we have any questions for SOAR? Anything about what the SOAR operation has been doing with regard to broadband? And certainly, do we have anybody that wants to volunteer to help? I mentioned volunteer, didn't I? Sorry. Well, one thing I do want to mention, Kevin, and maybe you can talk just a moment about it, is when I joined the Last Mile Action Team at SOAR, One thing that I had noticed was that within the framework for each of the groups that had formed, it seems like broadband was like number one or number two on everybody's list, from education to tourism to even food services. So maybe you could mention a little bit about that.
Yeah, broadband's obviously critical for us. And you can see from our regional blueprint, the first goal we have on there is broadband. And that's because we think it feeds into all of these other things. We think it feeds into agriculture development. We think it feeds into tourism development, having a healthier community with these telework opportunities. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about this is analogous to other physical transportation infrastructures. This is the connector for our rural communities that's going to drive a lot of other activity. So that's why it's so important that we want to be here as a resource, as a part of the process to help you along the way, because this is one tool that we can use to really make improvements in a lot of the other areas of focus that we have.
So without the broadband, we're going to be failing in a whole lot of sectors.
I think without the broadband, it's going to be a lot more difficult to get these things done, and the broadband is a critical component to employ these new innovative technologies that result in efficiencies. I mean, that's the thing. We talked about funding here. The reason a lot of projects don't get done, even if we know they're good projects, is because we can't afford them. But broadband's going to drive down those costs. You're not going to have to travel to as many meetings like this. You're going to have telework, telehealth. That's going to drive down costs. That's going to make projects that maybe weren't feasible 5 years ago feasible in the future.
Plus, if you want to try to recruit tech companies to help replace old jobs, they're not going to come when you get 5 up and 2 down.
Absolutely.
That's a big thing.
Yeah.
How many people in here are actually serving on a SOAR work team or work group right now? So, thank you. If you're interested in that, regardless of whether the topic is agriculture, broadband, tourism, you know what all those are.
Yeah.
I do not. Please get with Kevin. I mean, we really need this to be a grassroots effort with the whole SOAR initiative. We don't want it to be, something that just, the same 10% of people that are always involved in everything are involved in this too. We really need some fresh blood and some fresh ideas in this. So, Kevin, thanks for everything SOAR's doing.
Thank you.